Hope you like the introduction. My wife wrote it. So if you want a good introduction, you get your spouse to write it, right? They can only say nice things. Tonight, I'm going to share with you a presentation that I call A Path to the Good Life. We're here to talk about investment, but we're really here to talk about three big questions. If you're like most of my clients, you're here because maybe you'd like to learn how some people are paying off their mortgages and becoming debt-free in 10 years. Or maybe you're here because you'd like to learn how people are putting their children through university without it being a burden on them on a monthly basis. Or maybe you're here because you'd like to learn how some clients are building extra wealth for retirement. So through the course of today's presentation, my goal is to show you how for the last 15 years I've been helping clients answer these questions through using real estate as the vehicle to achieve those things. And I can tell you right now that there are people in this room who can do the exact same and duplicate and triplicate what I do for my clients. You have the capabilities. You may just not have the information. So my goal tonight is that you leave here now knowing what is possible and what you can do and how you can accelerate yourself to pay off these things a whole lot faster. Okay, now let's start with the safest way. So from when you were this little, in terms of investment, what did your parents tell you to do with your money? Piggy bank, right. Or bank account, savings account, right? So let's just say that it was a savings or a GIC account. Can I ask you, what do you think the average return today is in a GIC or a savings account? Point zilch? I like that one. Okay. So let's just say it's 1%. It's somewhere in the range, 1, less or more, but it's around 1%. So at 1%, the interesting thing though is that if you invested $10,000 in 1 year, that $10,000 turns into $10,100. Okay? So that's exciting, isn't it? That really won't get you there, right? But here's the other thing. See, that $100, it's actually taxed as income. You understand that? So if you earn interest on your money, it's treated as income. And so that 30% tax, if you're in that regular marginal rate, means that that $100 actually becomes $70, which gives you a positive 0.7% return on your investment. So we've got that, but do we live in a world where prices remain the same? We live in a world where there's this little thing called inflation, right? Is the price of food going down? Most certainly not, okay? So let's do the math. If we've got a 0.7% positive return, and we're in a world where prices increase by, say, around 3% a year, then the effective saving does this to your money, right? You're going backwards around 2.3%. So what does that mean? It means that that $10,000 that you invested or saved in that savings GIC or whatever the case, it's now worth $9,770 12 months later in terms of what it can buy. Does that make sense? Yeah? It doesn't make sense, but that's how it is, right? Now, I'm not putting this up here to tell you not to save. Saving is, of course, important. But saving by itself it's obvious it's not going to get you to what I call the good life. It's not the key to being able to pay off other debt, build wealth for your children's education, or build wealth for retirement. That's pretty clear right now. And the problem with this type of investment is that we have income, very little income, but also we have zero growth on the asset itself. So listen when I tell you, this is very important to understand. If you're buying an investment, before you buy an investment, you need to figure out, does it produce income and grow in value? Okay? This thing here, it produces income. It gives you a dividend, or sorry, in this case, it's an interest rate, which gives you cash. A stock, let's just say that you bought stock in IBM computers, okay? The stock itself at $100 could increase in value, right? It could increase to 120 or 110. So the asset itself can increase in value, but also the asset gives you or can give you a dividend. So it gives you growth and income. Cash does not give you growth. It can only give you income. Does that make sense? So when we're going to buy an investment, and back in my time as a financial planner, the things that I learned there is that we must look to control assets to do two things. They must grow in value and produce income. Okay? One without the other is not a complete investment. Okay? And it won't get you to the finish line. And the other thing we must do is we must look to expand more than what we have now. So if right now we have $100,000 to invest, that is great. But if that $100,000 could be invested and leveraged into an asset that grows in value and produces income, then that warrants some further investigation and consideration. Okay? So if you leave here tonight with nothing else, I want you to leave here with an understanding of this slide. This slide explains to you how banks make lending decisions and how banks rate risk in different asset classes. As an investor, would it be nice to know how the banks invest their own money? I think so. And so here, let's just say that we've got an asset, so we've got the ability to invest $100,000, okay? So Kathleen read in my introduction that I used to be a financial planner, and it was often the case that clients came to us with $100,000. In most cases, it was not $100,000 cash. Not many people have $100,000 cash in the bank. In most cases, it was $100,000 of equity in the home that they lived in. Right? And they came to us and they said, okay, Dion, our house is worth $600,000, our debt's at $200,000, we could access some equity. What could we do with this equity? So I'm going to share with you what I learned in my time as a financial planner. So back then, clients would come to us, we'd have $100,000, and they might want to see, okay, what can we do with this money? And the reality is, where you can invest your money in today's world, there are three key areas. You can choose to buy a business, buy some shares, or buy some property. They are the three key areas in which you can choose to invest. There are other things like foreign exchange and Bitcoin, but what's available and what's realistic for 95% of us is on the page here. And other things that you're thinking about, like RSPs, mutual funds, they're all sort of covered under shares. Okay? So if these are your options, I want you to imagine that tomorrow you walk into your bank with $100,000 and you drop it on the table, and you go to the bank manager and you say, hey, Mr. Bank Manager, here's my $100,000. I'd like to invest. Let's start talking about investment and using business as an investment. How much will your bank lend me, Mr. Bank Manager? How much will you lend me to go off and buy a business? I'm going to put $100,000 in. How much will you lend me? Has anybody in the room tried to do this, get a business loan? No? Okay, anybody want to guess? 65%? Okay, that's pretty good. Anybody else want to guess what that might be? So 65% would be they'd lend you $65,000? Yeah? Okay, that may be the case. And I'm going to be generous here and say they're going to lend you 100. But I can tell you that in most cases, the answer would be 0. Okay? And the reason behind that is it all comes down to risk. Do you all know, after 5 years, what's the success rate of small business? Huge failure rate. Close to 90% failure rate. Okay? So if I'm a bank and I'm in the business of lending money, I'm likely not excited to lend money that has a 90% chance of failure, right? Now, I will say one thing. If instead of $100,000 you walked into your bank with $1 million, you would get a very different answer. Because you would be able to buy a much bigger business, a business with systems in place, a franchise maybe, and as such, they might be happy to go and lend you $2 or $3 million to go off and buy a McDonald's or a Tim Hortons or a Canadian Tire franchise, right? So while that's an option, most of the people that we dealt with didn't have $1 million in their home. They had closer to 100,000 or 200,000. So it's an option, but it's not an option that many people choose to take. So let's just say you were able to get this 100 by some miracle. That means that you could go off and buy a $200,000 business. Okay, so now let me ask you this question. We're trying to do this as an investment. We're doing this for the purpose of investment. So at $200,000, do you think you've bought a business where you could take the keys and hand it to a 20-year-old and say, okay, you run this business, I'm going on holidays, I'll be back in 6 months? Do you think that's a reality? No. Definitely not, right? The likelihood is you've bought yourself not just a business, but you bought yourself a job, right? And it's a business that you'll be working in, and it's not a 9 to 5. It's a 9 to 9 plus weekends and other evenings. And at that point, you may as well just become a real estate agent and join Tom's team, because that's the hours that they work, right? So, and it doesn't cost $200,000 to become a real estate agent, right? So while that's an option, again, it's not one that most people chose. Okay, so we go back to the bank manager, we say, thank you, Mr. Bank Manager, we've talked about business, now let's talk about shares. Instead of buying a business, maybe I want to buy some shares. Here's my $100,000. Okay, go and get your number one financial planner, bring her in the room, I will give her my $100,000. And I will do whatever she tells me to do because I have faith in your bank and I have faith in her advice. Okay? I'm going to give her $100,000. Mr. Bank Manager, how much money will you lend me to invest with your number one financial planner? 0? 0 is likely the correct answer. Okay? It's likely the correct answer. But let's be generous and just say they're going to give you $100,000. Okay, now you can go off and start a $200,000 stock portfolio. Okay, great. Okay, now we've looked at option 1 and option 2. Now let's look at option 3. Here's $100,000, Mr. Bank Manager. I would like to buy a property. I don't know where that property is. It could be in this neighborhood, the next one. It could even be in the next province. I don't know if it's a condo, a townhouse, a duplex, whatever the case. I don't know what it is, but I would like to buy a property. As long as I qualify, how much money will your bank lend me to go off and buy a investment property? And the answer is $400,000. 80% loan, 20% down payment. Meaning with that, you could go off and buy a $500,000 piece of real estate. Does that all make sense so far? Yeah? That sounds familiar? Okay. So at this point, I want to stop and I want you to ask yourself this question. What does it mean when a bank, and let's talk about shares and property, what does it mean when a bank will maybe, maybe lend you $100,000 to buy some shares versus $400,000 to buy some property? According to that, which is the riskier asset class in the eyes of the bank? Shares. By a factor of how much more is it riskier? 4 times? Is that right? So property's 400% safer than shares? Shares is 400% riskier than property? Guys, I'm not saying this. I'm not saying it. The bank's lending decisions are saying this. Does that make sense? Meanwhile, your whole life, your bank's been telling you, hey, you're richer than you think. Come on in here. Come and sit in the comfy green chair. And we'll put all your money over here. Oh, but we wouldn't put our own money over there. No, the bank puts their money over here. But we want you to put your money over there. That's pretty clear, right? So, the thing around that is I think you should be a little bit jaded because you've been fed a story. Because do you know why they want you to invest in shares? Have you heard of this thing called a management fee? Yeah? And do they only collect that management fee on your funds when you make money? No. They collect that management fee regardless of performance. Right? They could lose you 50 grand that year and they will still collect their fee. Okay? So this is probably where most of you in this room invest your expendable income. Right? At the end of the year, you look at your numbers, you go see your financial planner, you probably put some money into RSPs, RESPs, something along those lines. Okay? And you're effectively abdicating your investment decisions over to somebody else. Okay? And just hoping for the best. But, okay, so now we're angry at the banks. That's great. But let's actually turn this into something that's meaningful to us in our lives. Who here would like to make $100,000 in the next 5 years? Anybody okay with that? Nobody? Okay, the rest of you guys can just leave now. It's okay. All right. So you two, for the 2 people who put their hands up, in that business, let's just say that you bought that business that we talked about over here. That $200,000 business, if you want to make $100,000 on that $200,000 business, you need a 50% return on your investment, right? To make 100 with 200. Okay? In the stock market, it's the same. Okay, we need a 50% return on that 200,000. I'll put that another way. In the stock market, that's earning 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 5 years in a row. Okay, hands up if you've achieved that. Some of you might have. Anybody? Nobody in this room? Okay. All right, so now let's look at this property. This property here is worth $500,000. We want to make $100,000 on that $500,000 piece of property. And so, what we need is a 20% return. Okay? $500,000 asset, $100,000 return, it's 20% a year. 100,000 is 20% of 500. Put another way, that's an average annual return of around 4%. Okay, that means that a piece of real estate that you're buying for $500,000 goes up by 4%, and it's now worth, a year later, $520,000. Who here in the room owns a piece of real estate? The house you live in? Only a few of you? Okay. So I can tell you, well, let me ask you this question. Do you think it's unrealistic that a property that you own for $500 a year later would be worth $520? It's not unrealistic. In fact, is it something that each and every one of you in this room has actually experienced in your life? In fact, you've experienced returns much greater. Am I right? Yeah? And so let's just summarize this slide. Shares is 4 times riskier than property. Property is 4 times safer than the share market. And in the share market, in order to earn $100,000 over a 5-year period, you would have to achieve returns that not one person in this room has ever achieved. But in the piece of property, you only have to achieve a certain level of return that every single one of you in this room has actually achieved. Does this make sense? Okay. All right, so I didn't get many hands raised before, so I'm going to ask you a more exciting question. The question is, who here would like to earn 25% return on their money every year? Hands up. If you don't put your hand up, you must leave. Okay, everybody's staying. Here we go. Here's how it works in real estate. And the truth is, all of you have probably experienced this, but you just didn't know it. You purchase a property for $500,000. Remind me, how much down payment out of your pocket do you need to put into this investment? 20%, and 20% on that is $100,000. Okay? Because the bank's going to lend you 80%, which would be the $400,000. Make sense? Okay. So, at that, okay, now let's assume that property prices increase by 5%. Now, why have I used 5%? 5% is the GTA 50-year average of price appreciation. Okay? So that means that over the last 50 years, which includes a couple of dips, okay, we've averaged 5%. If you look at only the last 10 years, that number would be in excess of 10% a year. Should we use that number? No, because we all know we've lived in a period of time where we've seen extraordinary growth, and it is not a number that we should base our financial future on. I want to base my future on the 50-year average. I've made my financial plans for me, my family, my children on this number, 5%. So at 5%, if property values increase, it means that the property that you bought for $500,000 is now worth how much? $525,000, right? So it's increased by how much? $25,000. And remind me, guys, how much of your own money did you put into this deal? $100,000. So can you see this? Can you see this now? It should be as clear as day. You have a 25% return on your $100,000. Does that make sense? Okay. Now I want you to ask yourself this question: if you had not invested in this property, if you had not put that $100,000 into this property, where would that $100,000 have otherwise been for the last 12 months for most people if they were investing in? GICs, stock market, right? That means in the same year your GIC would have had to give you a 25% return, right? Anybody get that GIC? Let me know. I'll put my money there, okay? Also, it means that in the same year you'd likely have to get a 25% return in the stock market, okay? And you might get lucky that year, but it's unlikely that that's going to be continual, right? So I hope you can see that. Well, and for all of you who live in your house, let's just say that the house you live in is worth today the day you bought it, it was worth $400,000. And you were one of the lucky people who could just put 20% $20,000 down because maybe you bought 5% down, okay, 20 grand down, and that property increased by 20 grand, you actually got 100% return on your money that year. You may not have realized it, but that's what happened, okay? All right, so that's how people get this type of return in real estate. Most of my clients are getting returns greater than this, 35 to 40%, and I'll cover that in the future slides, but 25% is relatively realistic. It can't be guaranteed. Nobody can guarantee anything in the world of investment. We can only base it on history. But 25% is a pretty good return on money, I think. Okay, and then we get this question. Hang on, what about the risks? Because we're borrowing money, and everybody knows borrowing money is risky, right? I disagree. In my time investing and seeing other people win and lose in investment in real estate and other things, I've learned that risk is not equal to the amount of debt that I owe. Okay? Risk is a function of three main factors. One, the demand for the asset that I own. Two, control that I personally have over that asset. And three, the exit strategies available to me if I want to dump that asset and move on with my life. Okay? So let's look at this in the context of shares. Okay? Let's say 4 years ago, you were the proud owners of blue chip stock by anybody's standard. You own stock in the world's #1 vehicle manufacturer. Okay? Now let's imagine in this imaginary world that 2 years ago, that vehicle manufacturer was found to be lying on all of their emissions testing and all of their marketing. Anybody know the name of that company? Right, Volkswagen. If you owned stock in that company, what happened when that news hit? What happened to demand for that asset at that time? It plummeted, right? What control did you personally have over the value of that asset? Nothing. And in terms of exit strategies, what's available to you? You have to sell at a loss, right? Or you gift them to your grandchildren and hope that vehicles still exist 70 years from now, right? Okay, so let's look at this in the context of real estate. So what if I told you that there's this secret city in North America where, whether or not you like it, at least 100,000 people move there every single year? Would you like to know the name of that city? You happen to live in it, right? Toronto, every single year, receives 100,000 plus. I believe last year, that in terms of the Golden Horseshoe, we received over 150,000 people. What does that mean? People mean demand, right? Demand for housing. You know, real estate's really simple, guys. Jobs bring people. People lead to price growth. That's it. They're the three things you need to know about property investment. Okay? So, you are blessed to happen to be living in the middle of that city, where, whether you not like it or not, every year people come. I know every time I jump into the 401 and try and drive in peak hour traffic, right? You'll know what I'm saying. You sit there and you go, damn bloody immigrants blocking up the roads. And then I remember, oh, I am one, right? They keep letting us in, right? And that's a good thing. That's a really good thing. It's a really good thing for real estate because demand is coming. And by the way, in terms of the entry to this country, do you think that, you know, they're letting in any poor Joe, or are people coming here with money? People are coming with money, right? That's what's been driving your prices. Okay, so let's just say that we did some research. Even within the Golden Horseshoe, there are areas where there's better infrastructure, better transportation, better jobs, okay, or more jobs being created. So what if we were able to focus in on those areas? And I strongly encourage you to talk with Tom and his team, because these guys know where the infrastructure and jobs are going. Okay? And it's not about what happened yesterday or last year. It's about where's it going to be in the next 2 to 5 years, right? You need to know that. So demand. Let's find out where the demand is, even within this great area of demand. Control. Let's just say that you went off and you bought a less than perfect house in a great area of demand. in terms of control, are there things that you can do with your two hands to impact the value of that piece of real estate? Yeah. Or if you have very soft hands like me, you'll just call some people to do that for you, right? And so in terms of control, you have options. And in terms of exit strategies, well, you can rent it, you can sell it, you could improve its value somehow and then increase its value for rent or sale. You can change its use, make it into a duplex. You can do a rent to own where you find a tenant who's willing to buy it from you and therefore pay a higher rent for a period of time. Or, and this is a very popular one which we do very often with our clients, we find a property, we increase its value, then once it's increased in value, we go and access the new equity in the property. We take some cash out. What do you think they do with that cash that's back in their hands? They go buy more, right? Okay, now, how do people really get wealthy in real estate? Well, they get wealthy by holding a piece of real estate for the longest period possible, in my experience. And it's all because of this thing, the compound effect. So, I want you to imagine that you went out and you bought a property. And that property was today, let's say $350,000. So, we're talking the very low end of the property market. I want to be clear, I know that these properties don't exist here. But even if you were to double that number, okay, you'll still be able to find properties that work cash flow-wise. And these numbers are amplified even more so. But let's start with something small, 350. At 350,000, assuming that property grows in value by that 5% number that we've been talking about, it means that property is going to increase by $17,500 in a year. Does that make sense? Yeah. I want to point out that that's about $1,500 a month. That's a pretty good return on investment, $1,500 a month. And we end that year with this value, $367,500. Okay? Does that all make sense? It's pretty simple math. So what happens when we start year number 2 is we start with that number, $367,500, right? And if we get the same 5% growth, the dollar increase is higher because we started the year with a higher number, right? Everybody with me? Yeah? Okay. And so on and so on. And so at the end of 5 years, your property is now worth $446, and you paid $350. And the differential between what you paid and what it's worth is very small, but it's small to read, but it's a big number. It's $96,000. Okay? And also, during that period of time, if this is a rental property, you've been collecting rents, and what do you do with that money? You pay down your mortgage, right? Okay. So if we're paying down the mortgage, paying it down to, say, $36,000 over the same period of time. Okay? And so what that means is if you add those two numbers together, that's the impact on you and your family's net worth over 5 years. You've increased your personal net worth by $132,000. Does that make sense, everybody? Yeah? Okay. Now, I want to address this topic of cash flow. Okay? So 10 years ago, you could drive, 20 minutes east, buy a property, and that property from day one, the rents would cover the monthly cost of ownership. Okay, it would cover the mortgage, the property tax, the insurance. Okay. A couple of things happened in the last 10 years. House prices doubled or tripled. Do you think rents doubled or tripled? Not to the same extent. They're certainly catching up, but they're not quite there. And so in today's world, we're finding situations where when we're trying to buy investment property, those numbers might be just even. They're just covering each other. And in some cases, they might actually be negative. Might be $100 or $200 in the negative. I want to give you a quick example. Let's just say that in this situation, the cash flow was negative by a big number. Let's say it was $500 negative. Okay? I wouldn't say you should buy that property, but let's just work the numbers. If it was $500 negative every month, meaning every month you have to reach into your pocket. Oh, by the way, I want to let you know that there are people in this room here who right now are reaching in their pocket and paying $500 a month towards our ESPs, our RSPs, mutual funds and savings accounts. Okay? So that's what they're doing with their money now. But let's say instead of doing that, those people decided to direct that $500 to this piece of real estate. So in 1 year, that would result in a negative cash flow of $6,000. $500, 12 months, $6,000. Over 5 years, that number would be negative by $30,000, right? 30,000. So what that means is this number here, instead of it being 132, it'd be only 102. Does that make sense? Would you still be okay? Okay. And let's consider, what could you have otherwise been doing with your money over that same period of time? You could have been taking it and investing it in mutual funds, okay? And let's say those mutual funds got the same kind of return, 5% a year, okay? I've done the math, and the math is, if you put that $500 a month into that mutual fund at 5%, then at the end of 5 years, you'd be left with about $35,000. So keep doing what every other Canadian is doing and end up with 35 grand, or maybe aim for 102. It's around 3 times more. Does that make sense? At this point, I want you to ask yourself this question. Are you doing the best you can with what you have? And remember, what you have is not just money, it's time. And a lot of you are wasting time right now. Okay, so, by the way, does anybody think these numbers are ridiculous, or are they reasonable? I think they're reasonable. I think they're very reasonable. In fact, they're probably on the low side. But if that number is true after 5 years, and we just kept on holding that property, right, then this is the number after 10, 20, and 30 years. That's just one property held for that period of time. Now, I want to remind you that your investment in this was $70,000 because you didn't have to put $350 down on this property. You only had to put 20% down payment, right? Right. And so here's what would happen in 5 years. So in 5 years, let's just say that you sold this property. I'm going to come back to commissions and property and capital gains tax in a minute, but what that means is in 5 years, you'd get back, if you sold the property, you'd get back your $70,000 and you'd get back $132,000. So that equals a 190% return on your investment. Annualized, that's 38% a year. Okay? You remember earlier I said 25% a year? 25% was the number we said? But that didn't factor in principal pay down. See, in that same year where the property goes up, you're paying down the mortgage by about 10 grand. So 25 becomes 35. And we have compound, remember? Compound, year on year, it grows. This is how we get to 38. Okay, so the longer we own this piece of real estate, the greater the compound effect. So this is why here we're at 38 and now we're at 43, 55, 72%. Let me clarify, that's 72% return on your money every year for 30 years. Anybody's financial planner talking to them about that? 30% a year? Or, sorry, 72% a year? And at this point, I want to put my hand up and say, I could be wrong, okay? And maybe this is extreme. Okay. So what's the other extreme? The other extreme is this. Property prices increase by $0 in the next 30 years. Anybody here think that's true? Okay. So if that's not true and that's extreme, and maybe I'm extreme at my number, then surely the number might be somewhere in the middle, right? So what that means is, if it's not 72%, well, it's only 36%. Would you be okay if we landed at 36? Most definitely. Okay, so this is how I see property ownership. It's like you plant a seed, you give it a little bit of love. Over time, it grows in value, right? And it gives you income, which are these apples. And if you're like most of our clients, you'll end up with 3 properties. 3 properties is the magical number for our clients. Because most of our clients know that $1 million isn't enough anymore. Who here thinks that $1 million is enough to retire on? It's probably not. And so we've put our clients onto what we call the 15-year, $2 million plan. Here's how that looks. Let's say you buy a property, and property prices grow at 5%. The simple math on that, guys, is at 5% growth, prices double every 15 years. It's a little less, but we'll call it 15. That means that if you buy a property today, you could buy it for 500 grand. We'd actually get you financing for 500 grand. I won't get into technicalities, but you'd have an asset worth 500 and debt on it worth 500. Over time, 15 years, that property will increase in value to $1 million on average, and that debt will be paid down. The mortgage will be paid down to around 300,000, right? So what that means is your position on this one property is positive 700,000. I said to you earlier, most of our clients are trying to purchase at least 3 pieces of investment real estate because they want to get to a bigger number. If we did this 3 times, then your net worth would be 2.1 million. Simple math, right? Really simple math. It's not rocket science. And it's available to most of you in this room. So here's the, this is where most people are aiming for. Some people go for more, maybe 10 properties. Let's say we get to this positive position, we hold it for 20 years. It's worth 770 grand per property. And we're collecting around $4,000 a month rent on each of these properties. That's realistic, 20 years from now. That would be your position. You'd have $7.7 million worth of real estate, $40,000 a month in income. Even if you still had mortgages, and you would still have mortgages on these properties, even after servicing that debt, you'd still clear 30 grand a month. I'd be okay with that. How is this done? You know what, actually, let me just go back a second. I want to share with you a story. I had a client who was kind of in this position, okay? And he wanted to take his entire extended family on a vacation to Hawaii. So he wanted like a family reunion. But he knew that not everybody in that family could afford that trip. And so what he did was he just cut down a tree. He just paid for everybody. He sold the property and he paid for everybody. And I know, I don't like everybody in my extended family. So I know he paid for people that he didn't even like. Right? But he was able to do that. And you look at that and you go, wow, that guy just gave up $770,000. That's a lot of money, right? But I want you to remember, what did he hold on to? He held on to a portfolio worth more than $7 million. He was still holding this $7 million. And if that $7 million, what happened is that $7 million, it grew by that 5%. In that 1 year after the loss, he regained 5%, 700. It's $350,000 in 1 year. In the second year, he'd regained 700,000. You see that? And this brings me to what I see as some fundamental flaws with traditional financial planning. Traditional financial planning, tell me if this sounds familiar. When you're young, you can go into a growth portfolio. You can take some risks because you can take some losses. Okay? When you're a little bit older, you have to go into a balanced portfolio. A little bit less risk, a little bit more income. Okay? And then, when you're about retiring, they're going to chop down all your trees and turn everything into an annuity or a pension or some kind of income fund. Does this sound familiar? It should. Okay. The problem with that is that at that time in your life, at retirement, okay, when growth assets can actually protect you, remember that protected this guy? It helped him replenish his loss. When they can protect you, your financial planner is taking it out of your portfolio. It's like he's chopping down all your trees, right? Putting all the apples over here. And then every year you've got to go to him and say, oh, please, sir, can I have some more? But don't give me too much, because if you give me too much, then maybe I won't have enough when I'm 90. This is the sad reality that many Canadians face at retirement. And they're not living in true wealth. They're living in fear. So this guy set it up differently. He held on to growth assets in retirement. And by the way, guys, all these properties, this 770, that's the net position. It means the property's worth 870, and they've all got debt. They've got about 100 grand debt each. And that's the other flaw in financial planning. In retirement, they say you should have no debt. Debt is bad in retirement. I disagree. I think if that debt is controlling a growth asset that produces income, remember those two things, then I'm good. I would rather hold on to that asset, because that asset's going to keep me safe in retirement. Does that make sense? I hope so. Okay, how does it work? Well, I want you to imagine that you're in this situation. You own a house worth 400, and you've got a mortgage of 200. Okay, so let's just say that's where you are at right now. And also you've got 20 years remaining on the mortgage. I want you to just write down this number. This family, right now, they've got 20 years left on their mortgage. Their mortgage today is at $200,000. 10 years from now, that mortgage will be paid down to $130,000. Can you all write down that number, or at least remember it? What's the number I'm trying to remember? 130,000? Okay, write that one down. Okay, so this is what they do. What they do is they exercise their ability to borrow. Oh yeah, so I want to get clear on something. Some people are under the impression that they have to be debt-free on the family home before they can go and buy more property. Okay? I want to be clear that you don't have to be in that situation. You just have to have some equity in your home. So this is the situation with these guys. Through a refinance, you can actually access 80% of the value of your property. So in this example, that would be $320,000. But remember, these guys already have a mortgage of $200,000. So the reality is we can only access an extra $120,000. Does that make sense? Yeah? So with that $120,000, they may choose to go off and buy that small piece of real estate for $350,000. They don't need $350,000, right? They only need the down payment. They need $70,000, which is the 20% down on that $350,000 piece of real estate. Now, earlier I asked you, would you like to learn how clients are paying off their home in 10 years? I asked you, maybe you'd like to learn how you're putting your kids through university or building wealth for retirement. Here's how we answer those questions. Remember I said to you that family, in 10 years, they're going to keep paying their mortgage, and their mortgage will be worth how much? $130,000? Okay. Well, let's imagine that, running alongside that, they've gone and bought this second piece of real estate. So they're doing their thing, but this piece of real estate's just jogging along beside them. Okay? And in 10 years from now, they decide to sell that piece of real estate. If they did that, that would be the gross proceeds of the sale. They would pay some capital gains tax and they would pay some selling fees. But they would still clear $200,000 cash. What could they do with that $200,000 cash? Could they pay off the mortgage on their family home? Yeah, and they'd still have about 70 grand left, right? I'm a mortgage broker. The number one question I get, Dion, what's the interest rate? And what people are really asking me is, Dion, how do I pay the least amount of money to those bastards at the bank? Right? That's what people are really asking me. And my answer will remain the same. There's multiple ways to get there, but the best way is to pay that thing off as fast as possible. End it early. Kill it. 2 ways to do it. 1 way. Don't go to restaurants. Don't go on holidays. Send your kids to crappy school. Take all your money and put it towards your mortgage. That's option 1. Option 2, plant a seed. Let that thing run beside you. Cash in and sell it and be mortgage free. So it's very counterintuitive. I'm telling you right now, to get into debt, to get out of debt, go into $500,000 more debt. Sounds crazy, but let me put it to you another way. Imagine if back when you bought the house you live in, you had the financial capacity to buy the house next door. Where would you be today? Could you not sell that house and be absolutely mortgage-free and then some? But back then, you didn't have the capacity. Back then, you probably were just struggling to get into this house. And you didn't have hundreds of thousands of dollars equity behind you. Now you do. Now you do. And now you have choices. Okay. All right, the second question. Paying for their kids' education. Okay, who here in the room has kids? Put your hands up, please. Okay, keep your hands up if you like them. Everybody likes their kids? Okay, good. I asked this question one time, and this lady put up 2 hands. And then I asked the question, keep your hands up if you like them, and she went like this. Anyway. Okay, who here has an RESP for their child? Education Savings Plan? Okay. For those of you who don't, this is how they work. Well, actually, 6 years ago, my wife, when we had our first child, we said, okay, we better get serious. Let's call the financial guy. The guy came to our house. His number plate said, Mr. RESP. I'm like, oh, we found the guy. He's going to help us. And he sat down and he explained this. It's $200 a month okay? You can contribute for your child. Over 20 years, it's $48,000. The government will match around $7,200. So you got $55,000 invested, right? $55,000 invested. And after 20 years, if it's invested properly, it should be worth about $100,000. Does that sound familiar? That's about the plan. So we sat there, we looked at it, he left the house, and we said, we could do that for 20 years. We could do that for 20 years and give our kids 100, or we could do this. So my kids don't have RESPs. My kids have houses. Don't tell them, they might kill us. But they have houses. That is our plan for them. Okay. Now, I want to point out that it's the same over the same period of time. And let's just say that you bought that property that was negative cash flow $200. Remember, you're already happily paying $200 to this RESP. You could instead be potentially servicing the debt on this other property at $200. The difference is, over here you end up at $100 grand, and over here you end up at $770. And the difference is there is a price of entry. Here you can start with $200. Here you must have the down payment. You must have $70,000. Otherwise, this is not for you. This is not within your reach. But here's my question to you. If it is within your reach, why would you be playing down here? Why would you be wasting your time? Because you could be playing up here and literally getting 700% higher returns. I hope we all do value our time. And the last thing here is, the last question is, how do we build wealth for retirement? Well, if you are, if you are under the age of 30, you buy one property, you wait 30 years, and hey, you're a millionaire. Congratulations. Okay. But very few of us are under the age of 30. Most of us are a little bit closer to retirement. Most of our clients who come to us are somewhere in their 40s and 50s. And this is why they come at that point. They've lived life long enough, they'll listen to all the advice, financial planners, parents, family, friends, and they see the finish line, 65. And they see what they got. And they're smart enough to do the math, and they say, holy crap, we're not going to make it. It's not going to be enough. And so what they do is they take some massive action. So instead of buying one property and waiting 30 years, what they'll do, if they've got a 10 or a 15-year runway, well, then they'll go out and buy those 3 properties now, right? And they'll achieve the same kind of results over a compressed period of time. At this point, I want to share with you my personal story. So you might have heard earlier, I was born in Fiji, but I grew up in Australia. And the reason we moved is because Fiji went through some political turmoil in the 80s. And my family's story is a story that will be very, very familiar to the people in this room. They moved from a small country to a bigger country. They had fantastic jobs, white-collar jobs. My father was an airline executive. He became a factory worker. My mother was a teacher at an exclusive international school, and she became a checkout person at the supermarket. Does this sound familiar? In this room, it would be very familiar. But after, and so they went back like 20 years, right, financially. So they were earning the income of 20-year-olds, but the difference was they had 5 dependents, me being one of them, right? But they did what most immigrant families do. They knuckled down, they got reskilled, they finally found their way back into the work that they should have been doing. But they lost 5 good years of their life doing the other stuff. Then they paid off their home at age 55. And at that point in life, they went off and they borrowed money against the home they just paid off to go off and buy their first investment property. So today my parents are in their 70s and they live a very good life. So they bought a couple of properties, they sold most of them, they only own one. But that one is a triplex and it gives them around $4,000 a month. In addition to their $3,000 a month pension, they're making $7,000 in retirement, debt-free, living the good life, traveling here in a couple of months to see their grandkids, and they do that frequently. My dad golfs 5 days a week, and my mother shops 12 days a week. And their time apart is what keeps them together, apparently. That's what my mom said. But I share this with you to let you know that, even for them, I asked my dad, hey, that's kind of crazy. Age 55, you paid off your house, you've achieved the dream, and now you've gone and borrowed money to buy more property. I said, why did you do it? Were you not scared? Were you not scared? And he said, yes, I was scared. Yes, there was risk. But What was scarier was not the risk, but the certainty. The certainty that if he didn't take any action, that he would be dependent on government assistance in retirement. And that fear was, in fact, what compelled him to take action on this side, right? And quite often, it's the people who achieve the most in life are people who don't have other choices or don't like the choices available to them, and so they try a little bit harder, right? You'll understand that when an immigrant lands in a new country, they start well behind the starting block, and they have to run twice as hard to catch up. But most of them don't stop there, do they? Most of them keep that pace up and surpass the people of that land. Second generation doesn't, because they get a little bit comfortable, right? And so I think all of us have to remember that sort of immigrant mindset in that, and I want to be clear, all of you in the room here, you're probably going to be fine. You don't have to do any of this. But let me be clear, you are certainly not doing the best you can with what you have if you don't do something like this. And maybe you're okay with that. Okay, but I hope for more for all of you. This is what we talked about today, guys. We talked about wealth, time, and money. Wealth is time and money and no fear, right? Savings, why that's a thing, but it's not going to get you there. We talked about shares, business, and property, and why property is what the bank banks on, and how you can use that knowledge to pay off your home, pay for your kids' education, and build wealth in retirement. So guys, you've been kind enough to give us some of your time tonight. I want to let you know that I hope that you take this time, and again, this is not wasted time for you, because through Tom, what we're offering to you is a free 15-minute consultation where we can figure out whether or not this information can be applied to you in your life. So I would certainly say, don't just waste the last 35 minutes. Convert it, take an extra 15 minutes, and figure out if this is something that you can do in your life. Otherwise, you'll be back here in another 3 or 5 years, having been a spectator, while all the other people on the playing field have done this and achieved great things. So I wish the best for you. Oh, and the other thing is, this here, guys, this is my cell phone number, okay? I understand that some of you are handing in forms. If any of you are very keen and would like to just move this forward, send me a text message. You'll get responded to immediately. Okay, have a good evening, guys. Bye for now.
So thank you to Kathleen. She's our coach for our team, and she helps us get great information so we can help our clients. I wanted to thank Dion for a great presentation today, and that's so much valuable information that you can take action on. Now, there's some housekeeping items I'd like to talk to you about. Everyone has provided a questionnaire sheet. Please write down questions that you have for Dion, myself, and Katie's going to be coming in next. And also Mr. Khan, our accountant, is here too. So we have a question period after we all talk. Now, first I'd like to call in our team now, because I know all of you haven't seen our team. So if all of you could come up front and just say hi to everyone. So we have John, Raheem, John, Sissy, Lauren, and Karen. So the reason I brought them up here is you would be talking to a lot of them on the phone or while you're calling us. So you can actually have a face to relate to them. So thank you, and they have done an amazing job servicing our team clients. So thank you to them. So Dion did talk about what you can do to invest. What I'd like to discuss today is what our past clients have actually done. So I'm going to go through different slides where our past clients have invested and they've actually made these type of returns. So here on a condo, this is the return they made per year over 10 years. And this is someone who has actually sold the property. The next one is a triplex where they invested and the yearly return is 59.97%. So the numbers that Dion were talking about is very related to what we are showing with our actual clients that had bought and sold. The next one is the house they invested, and per year the return was 52.97%. Now, a lot of people would have questions as to, where did these numbers come from? This is something that we can meet, or you can call and we can discuss as to how these returns came from. But Dion did go through it a bit in his presentation earlier. Now, over years, what we have done too is that a lot of our clients don't have the money to invest a large sum of money. So what we have done for our past clients is invested in unit shares, which is very similar to this limited partnership. And we have done projects over years where they have made returns. So I'll just show you a few of the projects that we did. So this is a new built house. So we took out the old house and built a new one. The return for our unit shareholders was around close to 14% here. The next one is a property we bought. We were planning to sever it, but then what we decided to do is the price had gone up, so we decided to sell that, and the return we got on that one was about 18% here. The next one was a reno. So we do new builds, reno. These are different projects we do, and on the reno we got was 16% return. So we are working on a few new projects. These are in phases 1 where we haven't got the approvals, but what we do is once we get the approvals, then what we do is we actually call our clients first to see if they would be interested in investing in unit shares. Now, what is key is I think everybody is comfortable in their own investment. So it could be what Dion talked about. It could be the location that they're looking for. But what is key, I think, for all of us today is that we have a team who's going to give you a lot of information. What is also key is that when we give you information, we're not putting pressure on you to make a decision. We make you comfortable in making a decision because that's what we have our values based on. So when you have projects that you look at, and this has happened to a lot of families that we know, and I'm sure you have also heard of stories where people have gone and bought new build from new builders, like pre-construction. And what has happened is over past 2-3 years, the prices dropped from what they had bought. So it's more like speculative buying. And what I would like to inform you is none of our clients actually got into that. So right now, the builder's actually selling those properties that they bought for almost 100 to 150,000 less. So that was mainly on speculation. So what we always tell our past clients is that if you do come across projects that you know of and you want to get information, call our team because we know the location, we know the type of project. Before you invest, if you actually call us, we can guide you as to if it's the right thing to buy or not. Sometimes I look at certain buyers buying new build from pre-construction right now at maybe $800 a square feet or $1,000 a square feet, when you can get that same type of property, maybe phase 1 or phase 2, for maybe $200 square feet less. So, and mind you, they are actually buying this for investment. So the numbers really don't match because by the time they buy it and come closing time, they want to rent it, the cash flow doesn't match what they bought for. So it's key that, our team is experienced, they know the location. All we need you to do as our clients is actually just call them and ask them, is this a good project? Is this a good buy? And they'll be glad to help you out there. So now you all would be asking this question, now, is this a good time to buy? And what we have found is that over years, if you look at this chart, the price has, from 1995, the price has been keeping going up. There was a slight dip in 08 and 09, and then it kept going up. In 2017, we all know the market, the first quarter, it actually peaked, and then the price dropped. So we know the graph is actually going up on the long term. When we look at investors coming or buyers who are coming to look at investment, they ask us this question, to our team, is this a great time to buy? So we think that this is a great time to get in, because right now you are here where the market dropped, and it's only going to keep going up. So what we would suggest is it's all based on what you can afford, what you can buy, based on the location. Once you know what you want to get into, please let us know.
Can you guys hear me? Yes? That's okay? Okay, I don't have lapels, so I have to figure something out. We're going to change the topic a little bit here, right? Because I am focused on estates, which is like death, right? Which I know that people really don't want to talk about that a whole heck of a lot, but aren't you working really hard every day? A lot of us are anyway, so that there's something for our family at the end when we're not around to provide for them, or right? So we've got goals for today and goals for retirement, but also goals for the future when maybe we're not even around. And so making sure that what we call our estate plan is really well sorted out is going to help your kids or other family members, or maybe charities, if that's what you're thinking at the end of the day. And when I say estate plan, I have a lot of people say, well, I'm not a millionaire, so I don't have to worry about that. And basically, if you own real estate anywhere in the Golden Triangle, you are a millionaire, okay? Because that's sort of what happened with real estate prices these days. So you have a big estate, and let's make sure that it's actually going to go where you want it to go. You don't really probably want it to go to income tax and probate tax and all these other places it can go. Okay, so we're going to try and cover about 5 topics. Tom, when do you want me to wrap up to give time for questions? Okay, like 10 to 9, something like that. I don't have a clock, so if one of you could try and get my attention when we're getting there, that'd be good. And we're going to try to cover 5 kind of general topics. And you've got a little scratch pad, I think, in front of you. But we're going to start with communicating your wishes. So I'm not going to put you on the spot. I have done that in other presentations and said, tell me, do you have a will? And nobody wants to admit they don't have a will. But I'll tell you that they did a study on this, and 50% of adults in Ontario do not have a will. And that's a pretty scary statistic. There are some countries where you could live there, you can die there, you can own assets there, and it's okay to not have a will because of the way the legal system works there. That doesn't work so well in Canada, because we're a common law jurisdiction. And common law jurisdictions, you tend to need to have a will to actually get the result that you're going for here. Now, if you have a will, is it a valid will? So my dad got remarried and didn't understand that marriage automatically revokes or kills your will in Ontario. So he floated around without a will for like 5 years before he finally realized that. People who, obviously this is what I do every day. So one of the questions I always have for a client is, okay, you have a will, that's great. How long ago did you do it? Okay, you wouldn't believe the old documents that get put in front of me, the 1 or 2 page wills that get dropped on me. Like, oh, no, that's a will, but it's not really what we're going for. Yeah, do you even know what your will says? Okay, a lot of my clients have a will, but when they start looking at it again, they realize that it doesn't speak to their situation at all. Now, in Ontario, we are, I'm going to say lucky, because you can have one will, and in fact, you should have one will, and that's great, but you can actually have more than one will as an Ontario person. And if you have certain types of assets, so if you own shares of a corporation, that's one of those kinds of assets, or units of a limited partnership is another kind of asset like that, or some very specific pieces of real estate, then having two wills can actually end up saving something called probate tax for the sake of your ultimate beneficiaries at the end of the day. Has anyone heard of probate tax? Yeah, people kind of hear about it. They hear that the government's going to take 1.5% of the value of your estate, and isn't that terrible? And, you know, there's ways we can plan around it, but I'll tell you that if you don't have a will, you haven't planned around probate tax because you have not taken a single step, right, in that direction. Now, there's also something to remember as well. We are a nation of immigrants, frankly, right? So a lot of my clients walk in and they don't just have assets in Canada. They have assets, frankly, all over the world, or they know they're going to get an asset once the parents in the home country die and they're going to end up owning the family home or the family farm or whatever it is. And nobody really understands how complicated an estate can be until they're actually doing it, because you wouldn't otherwise have to know. So I'm just going to tell you one fact. For those people in the room who happen to own real estate in a foreign country, so not in Canada, when you die, it's not Canadian law that applies to that piece of real estate. It shouldn't really surprise us, right, that the law of the foreign country applies to that real estate. And do you know what that law is going to do to your piece of real estate when you die? So that's just something to kind of keep in mind, right, is that we need to have a kind of global perspective about estate planning and make sure we're planned out for really every asset that you own. It looks like we have some married couples in here today. And, you know, do you own your house jointly with your spouse? Do you remember when you took title however many years ago? Did the lawyer might have asked you joint tenants? Or do you have a business and you only want the non-business owner on title? There are certain choices that we make as we go through life, how we own real estate. If we have an RSP, who's the beneficiary, that affects our estate at the end of the day. And sometimes we don't quite understand what we just did, like the impact of it tax and distribution-wise. Powers of attorney are really important as well. I told you that 50% of people don't have wills in Ontario. I like to wander, so I'm going to go in front of that a bunch of times. I feel like haven't been on this side of the room yet. So 50% don't have wills. 75% of people do not have powers of attorney. Now, I just want to explain what the powers of attorney do, because you're alive, okay, here. Imagine you're alive and you're in a coma. There are bills to pay, right? You got to file your tax return. There's things that have to happen that are financial. And in your head, you're probably thinking, that's okay, my spouse can do it for me, right? I'm lying in my coma, but my spouse gets to do that for me. Under the law, that is not what happens. If you do not have a power of attorney for property, the government takes over your assets and manages them for you. And your spouse will have to go and try to convince the government, it's an entity called the public guardian, to give that control back to your spouse. And wouldn't it have been much easier to do a relatively short document that would have just given that power to your spouse right from the get-go? Powers of attorney for personal care are about healthcare decision-making. So, of course, you're going to do that for yourself if you're okay up here, but if you're not, it's really nice to have a document out there that tells the doctor who they should be talking to next, right? So, what if you don't have a will? I'm not going to ask the question of who doesn't have a will there, okay? So here's what clients tell me is, well, I don't have a will, but that's okay because my spouse gets everything anyway, right? I'm like, no, that's not what happens under the law of Ontario. So what actually happens under the law of Ontario is that, yes, your spouse gets anything you own jointly with them. So the house that's in joint tenancy or the joint bank account. They'll get your RSPs if you have written your spouse's name down as the beneficiary. Everything else falls into what we think of as your estate, except you don't have a will. So you can't say it'll fall under your will. And what the law of Ontario says is those other assets, the ones that aren't joint, that are not beneficiary designated, the first $200,000 goes to your spouse. Of the remainder, your spouse, depending on how many kids you have, your spouse gets a third or a half, and your kids get the rest. And so your surviving spouse is left thinking, I didn't actually inherit everything at the end of the day. And now, your surviving spouse can be in a situation where he or she co-owns your assets with your children. I have children. I love my children, okay? But I don't want to be co-owning my assets with my children. I do not want to give them leverage over me if they're cranky with me and they're not going to sign the document I need them to sign in order to do this or that with the asset. And if your children are minors, That's really bad, okay? Because minors can't sign anything that's legally effective. So now guess what? Your surviving spouse is having to deal with another government entity called the Office of the Children's Lawyer to address any of these assets. So if that all sounds kind of bad, you know what it is. Like, let's not do that. Let's have a will instead is the logic of all of that. I went through all of that. Now, if you have a will, one of the things your will does is it names your executor. And your executor, it's really important to have one named because they're the person that the moment that you die can do things for you. If you don't have a will, you don't have an executor. And literally there is nobody who legally can do anything until the court essentially appoints someone to act like an executor. We call them an administrator for an intestate estate. So the executor is the person who gets to do all the work on an estate, but often if you have minor children, there's a guardian appointed who's like the caretaker of your children, make sure they go to sleep, that they go to school, that they get fed, and so on. And if you have children who are, you think maybe not quite old enough yet to manage their own money, then we often have a trustee also named. And a trustee is just somebody who kind of takes care of money now for the benefit of other people like your kids. So we need to have all these people named in the document, right? I would like you guys to choose who does those rules for you. I don't want anybody else to choose that for you. And we need alternates because we're generally naming people, and people die, and people become incapacitated, or they move away, or they just don't want to do it when the time comes. So we need a bit of a list here. And then we have to think about the fact that they are spending time doing things for you, and is it fair that they get a little bit of money to compensate them for all the hours that they're spending? So there's a lot of decisions that have to go into this. Executors also can get sued. I'm not going to go into this in any detail. We don't have the time for that, but these are all discussions that we have in trying to figure out what's the best estate plan for you. Again, this is not, for the Rockefellers, this is what's the actual practical, logical plan for you in your circumstances with your people and your assets. Then we want to make sure that everything else is covered off, right? The spouse, the kids, the money, other people, what about your body? What's happening to that? Is there going to be fights about organ donation? Let's be clear so we don't, my goal, I'm not a litigator. I don't go to court. I don't want to go to court. This is not how I want to spend my life. My job, as I see it, is to help my clients try to create a plan that's going to minimize the chance that this thing is landing in court for any reason at the end of the day. Sometimes we have family meetings. Sometimes we want to sit the whole family down and go, here's what mom and dad are going to do, and here's why. So kids, if you have grievances, raise them when your parents are alive and can address them as opposed to taking this to court at a later time. Okay, so the second of our topics is protecting your family. So, if you don't have family, think about the people that you care about, even if they're not technically family, or some people want to leave their estate to charity, and that's the meaningful thing there. Imagine if you are I don't want to be too determinative about this, but in a lot of families, there's one person who's in charge of the financial stuff, and everybody else gets to do whatever. But if the person who's in charge of the financial stuff dies, that puts that family into chaos if there hasn't been really good communication about who are the people, like who's the advisor, who's the accountant. If you have a lawyer, who's the lawyer? So you protect your family by communicating this kind of stuff to them. We talked about guardians already. If you have minor kids, I don't know how many we have in here that fall into that category, but yeah, we got to think about where are they actually going to live. Okay, so I'm just going to shortcut the whole blended family conversation by saying if you're in a second or a third or a 10th marriage, you got a complicated estate plan, okay? Especially if you have kids from various marriages, and I'm just going to say you're going to want to be super careful about how you plan all of that out. So I'm going to tell you what I call the scary spouse story, just as an illustration of why we need to think about these kinds of things. So I have a lot of clients who walk in my door, especially clients in a first marriage that have been married for, 30 years, okay? And financially, these clients are like this, right? They're like, I'm her, she's me, it's the same, we're all the same, it's joint everything, and away we go. And I will say, that's great. That's obviously been working for you for 30 years. Here's the scary spouse story. one of you dies, the survivor of you just got it all, right? They got all the assets by the joint ownership, by the beneficiary designation, whatever it is. And that surviving spouse is now the total, complete owner of all of your assets. They can do whatever they like with those assets. They can spend them, they can give them away. And despite every client telling me this will never happen, they can get remarried. And I will tell you that it does happen. So I had mentioned my father in the beginning here. You know, what happens when that remarriage occurs 5 years later, 15 years later, whatever it is? Well, that surviving spouse got it all. And then they're okay for 5 years maybe. They meet someone, they're like, oh, I want to get married. Boom, they get married. Boom, they just lost their will. Okay? And then let's say they had a will, they lost it. That will is the will that leaves all of the assets to the kids of that first marriage, and that will's gone now. So what I'll tell my clients is, look, you can keep everything joint and beneficiary designated and keep it all like that, but you just have to know the risk that you're taking. So I call this the Just Trust Me Honey plan, okay? So the Just Trust Me plan is the two spouses looking at each other in the eyes and saying, honey, if I'm the first to go, I promise you, well, first of all, I'm never gonna get remarried. I'm like, okay, let's put that on the side. If you did get remarried, what are you gonna do? There's two things that there's this kind of spousal moral promise, okay? The first thing that you hope that surviving spouse does is that they get an enforceable marriage contract. And those words, I mean, it's so tough to get a marriage contract in place. It's the least romantic thing you could possibly think of doing, but it is the most protective thing that you will do for the sake of your kids of that first marriage. And you really need that enforceable marriage. When people talk about a prenup, that's what I'm talking about here. But an enforceable one, done properly, like with lawyers and everything, not on the back of an envelope, okay? So a proper one that we don't want a judge to throw out, because you need the prenup for that surviving spouse to take the second step. So the prenup's not enough. Now you want the surviving spouse right after that new marriage to go put another will in place, right? Because they just lost their will. And you want that will usually to say, my estate to the kids of that first marriage. Like, I like this person, but they're not walking away with my millions of dollars. Okay, that's for the kids. You need a prenup to make a will that reads that way. Because if you get married and you don't have a prenup, the spouse you're married to when you die has the right to inherit the exact same amount they would have received had they divorced you. The calculation on death is exactly the same as the calculation on divorce. So, okay, that's why the prenup's important, because it kicks that right out the window so you can make the will you want, the one that leaves everything to the kids, let's say, as an example. We know that divorce is pretty financially destructive, right? Half the equity of the matrimonial home floats away with the ex-spouse and so on. So, Just Trust Me Honey planning is fine as long as we make sure that all those things really get done at the end of the day. Okay, we're still in protecting your family. I just want to mention something about beneficiaries that have disabilities, because unfortunately we see lots of bad results in this area. Beneficiaries with disabilities, particularly ones that are on ODSP or Ontario Disability Benefits, there are very strict asset tests, meaning that if I have a beneficiary who's on disability benefits and they get an inheritance, even if it's $50,000, they're knocked off disability benefits, which is not a good result, because not only have they lost their monthly check, they're also cut off the medical benefits that are provided to them. So I'm just throwing that out there because if that's anyone's scenario, that's something you really want to make sure that you plan for. Life insurance, often, we're working through an estate, I'm talking to my clients, and we might see that there's some pretty big tax liabilities that are coming down. Do we know what happens when a person dies, what the tax implications are of that? Okay, I'm just going to take a second on that. If you leave everything to your spouse, there's not a big tax deal there. That's pretty easy, frankly, because the government kind of thinks, well, your spouses are kind of intertwined. If you leave everything to your spouse, we're not going to kill you with tax then. However, when the second spouse dies and you're trying to get those assets now down to the next generation, to the kids, that's when all the tax chickens come home to roost, okay? That is when the government gets their tax. So when the second spouse dies, all RSPs and RIFs are fully taxable. So if you have $1 million RIF when you die, you can pretty much guarantee yourself that 500 grand of that is walking back to the government in tax. Secondly, when the second spouse dies, all of the assets that that spouse owns under tax law, they're considered to be notionally sold at fair market value. So if you have a lovely real estate portfolio with all these wonderful gains that we saw on those slides, okay, wasn't that great? Well, there is a tax bill to pay for that at some point in time. And the latest we can defer it is till the second spouse dies, and we're trying to get those assets down a generation. And I have a lot of clients with wonderful real estate holdings, and people who own real estate really don't like often the thought that they might have to sell it to pay the tax. And I have to say, well, okay, but then you need another source of liquidity to pay the tax. So sometimes life insurance is where we go with that, because hey, if we have a life insurance policy paying out on death, that's a pretty nice chunk of money to pay the tax, and maybe then you can keep the triplex that's rented out, or what have you. These are all obviously things that we want to. There's very little ability to manage all this when the person's dead, right? Like there's very little planning opportunities. It's much easier to manage when you're still around. If you have RESPs, I do have an RESP on Lexion, your will needs to have a clause about them because they're strange little assets and you want to make sure that they're treated properly. Pets are the new kids for some families, okay? So let's make sure that they're well cared for. Now, let's talk about kids for a sec. Well, first of all, let's go back to the spouse. Was anyone scared by my scary spouse story? Part of my job is to scare you a little bit so that you actually do some planning. But there are certain things called trusts that we can use to help us get some protection against that kind of scenario. We also have to think about the kids inheriting. There are things called trusts that we can do to help our kids as well. Because it's not just, the top generation, but our kids get married, our kids get divorced too, 50% still, right? The rate's still very high. And a lot of my clients are coming to me who have adult children wanting to make sure their inheritance is not going to get scooped by some ex-spouse, okay? And there's planning we can do for that. But again, not surprisingly, it's all going to be done in advance. We sometimes have beneficiaries that really shouldn't be managing money for whatever reason, okay? So we use trusts to essentially have somebody else be in charge of their money so that they don't get themselves into trouble. I've had clients walk in. I had a client actually just this week that walked in and said, I don't want my husband to inherit from me. I want it all to go to the kids. I'm like, well, I understand why you would want that. However, do you remember what we just talked about? Your husband has the right to inherit from you the same amount he would have received had he divorced you. So if you do a will that leaves everything to your kids, your husband can challenge that in court. And if he chooses to challenge it in court, he will win. So whenever we're drafting a will, creating an estate plan, we have to think about, is there anybody out there? We have a lot of freedom in Ontario. We should be grateful for that. There's lots of countries where there is no freedom in who gets your estate. There's a law that tells everyone who gets your estate. We have a lot of freedom here, but we do have some limits. People who have corporations really got to think this through, okay? Because the head of the corporation dropping dead is a serious problem for the business, if there is a business, succession planning, and so on. And sometimes people have vacation properties, so the family cottage or the Florida condo. We already talked about the fact that foreign real estate certainly is a complicating factor in an estate. We also have to think about the fact that there are also tax liabilities relating to those second properties. Okay, you get your home, you get one kick at the can, one principal residence exemption, that the capital gain on one of your homes is tax-free. You don't get 5 homes tax-free or even 2 homes tax-free, just one. Okay, I want to take 1 minute, I still have 5 minutes, I think, okay, to just mention probate and probate tax, because there's no reason to know anything about this unless you've been through an estate. But once you're in an estate, people's eyes are kind of opened and they're like, wow, I kind of wish that I had understood this when I was making my plan. So let's say that when you die, you own a piece of single name real estate. Okay, let's say that you're not married or for whatever reason this piece of real estate is in your name alone.
And let's say that you left it to your one and only beloved child who is 40. Okay, so that child's your executor, that child's your only beneficiary. Your child takes your will to the land titles office. It's the land titles office that kind of governs all Ontario real estate, right? And your child says, land titles office, give me this piece of property. Here's the will. You can see that I'm the executor, I'm the beneficiary. Just put my name on it, please. Well, the land titles office is not going to do that. So they're going to say no. I'm going to use Calvin as the name of the son, just because that happens to be the name of one of my sons. Okay, so they're going to say, Calvin, come back to us when you have something called a probate certificate. And the Calvins of the world wouldn't have any idea what that is. And that's okay, because the state's lawyers exist. They draft wills, and then on the other side of everything, they then help on an estate. So the estate's lawyer will help Calvin, my executor, get this thing called a probate certificate. Do you know why? Does anyone know why the land titles office will not hand over this piece of real estate just on the basis of the will? It is because the land titles office doesn't know that that is my last will. How could they know? I can do a will every day if I want to. I don't want to, believe me, but I could, okay? And so the land title, nobody really knows, frankly. Calvin doesn't even know if this is my last will or not. Because in Ontario, and please, please never do this, in Ontario you could wake up at 3 a.m., write something down on a piece of paper, and that could be your will. It could also be your grocery list, but it could be your will depending on the words that you use. And please don't do that, because those go to litigation every single day in this province. But the fact that you could do it means that the land titles office will look at this will and go, nah, well, we don't know. So this has always been the issue with wills. This isn't an Ontario thing. This is, a common law problem. Since there have been wills, there has been this dilemma for hundreds of years, in other words. So back in the UK, where common law started, they had to figure out a way to get through that dilemma, and the way we get through it is called probate. So all that probate is sending a pretty large stack of paper off to the court, a particular part of the court called the probate court. And when we do that, we're asking the court to bless the will as the last will that the person did. And frankly, the court doesn't know that any more than we do, okay? But they wait a little while after they get it. They see whether anybody sends in a newer will, and if it doesn't happen, then we get something back called the probate certificate, which is just a copy of the will we mailed them with a court document on top that now, hey, that's official. Now the land titles office will actually transfer the property. But the cost of getting the probate certificate is something called probate tax. So if you've heard of it, that's where it comes from. Probate tax is not an income tax, it's not a federal tax, it is literally the price of getting the probate certificate from the court, and it's calculated as 1.5% of the value of the assets. So a good estate plan will try to minimize that, not surprisingly. I have like 2 minutes. 2 minutes? I have 3 topics, 2 minutes, that's gonna work, right? Okay, so other considerations we gotta think about, are we doing charitable gifts, set dollar amounts, what's happening to your stuff, your clothing, artwork, furniture, jewelry. You would not believe how much people argue about stuff. It's quite incredible. Common disaster clauses, what if it's something catastrophic and we don't even have your kids around to inherit? Who's gonna get that estate now? Okay, I just want to take 1 minute to talk about making gifts to your adult children while you're alive. I'll shortcut it by saying you gotta be really careful if you're putting anything, whether it's real estate or investment accounts or anything, if you're putting your child's name on the ownership, because that is a pretty major thing to do from a legal perspective and from a tax perspective. So I'm just gonna indicate that you should get good advice about exactly how you're doing that to make sure that it's meeting your actual objective. Okay, we talked through powers of attorney already. Has anybody been named as somebody else's person? Like, have your parents named any of you to pay their bills or manage their health care or anything like that? It's important to know, first of all, you need these documents. And secondly, if you're acting as one of these people, just know that you're not allowed to give away all mom or dad's money, okay? Like, there's some limits on what you're allowed to do here. This is my last topic, so I'm actually gonna try and end on time. So, if you know anything about probate tax at all, if you've ever dealt with an estate, you'll know that people turn themselves often into pretzels to try to not pay probate tax. They'll commit fraud to not pay probate tax, and frankly, the government knew that, so they put in a whole roster of new rules. And so There never used to be probate tax auditors, but guess what? There are now. The retail sales tax auditors are now also auditing probate tax. There is now a probate tax return that has to be filed that says to the government, chapter and verse on how we got to our probate tax calculation, exactly what all the assets were, so that they can go audit it if they want to. They can reassess you. If you miss something, they can reassess you forever, okay? If you were a bad person and didn't pay your probate tax, these days, they can send you to jail. I haven't heard that that's happened yet, but now definitely the statutory law is there. So there's my last scary bit that I'm going to indicate to you. You're just going to make sure that it's done properly. So, hey, 8:52, that's not too bad. Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it, and I think we're probably at question time now at this point. So, thank you.